Welcome to the fourth meeting of the Lottery Trust Fund Task Force. Mariah, call the roll, please.
Senator Boswell, Senator Neal, Senator Tishner, Senator Wilson, here. Representative Grossberg,
Here. He's here.
Representative Rawlings,
Here.
Representative Riley, here. Representative Timoney, here. Co-Chair Deneen,
Here.
Co-Chair McCool.
Yep. Do we have enough for a forum? Not to do minutes yet. Okay. We'll hold off on approving of the minutes until we have a quorum. All right, today, folks, welcome to the meeting. This task force is charged with comparing the Commonwealth's current system of scholarship and grant programs with those of other states. Today, we will be hearing about other states are supported their students' post-secondary education. First, we have Dr. Stephen Pruitt, our former Commissioner of Education and the current President of the Southern Regional Education Board, to share with us his insights into how our neighboring states are tackling this challenge. So thank you for being with us, Dr. Pruitt. If you would, step up, make sure that the microphone is turned on and pulled up, and introduce yourself for the record.
Greetings. Stephen Pruitt, President of the Southern Regional Education Board. Always happy to be in Kentucky. So thank you for having me. We always appreciate when you guys ask us to do a little work for you, but mainly because I just love coming up here in the fall. There's nothing like a Kentucky fall because, as you may know, in Georgia, there's only 4 seasons if you count football. So we're always happy to be here. So we have pulled together some information for you. I've been asked to share my screen here and pull up my presentation. The mouse is all over the place. All right. But thank you for having us. Thank you very much. And I will try to get through this fairly quickly, but hopefully give you some good information. And as always, feel free to chime in and ask questions. What we tried to do is pull this together for you in a way that gives you a perspective of what's going on around other states. We pull some research of things that we found that are peer-reviewed that has shown some type of gain. And we'll close with a couple things that you may want to think about. So first of all, our focus, there we go, is in the areas of Kansas, Florida, Georgia, and obviously Kentucky, and South Carolina, and Tennessee. We're mainly focusing on those areas because those are the ones that are truly using the majority of lottery funds toward their scholarships. West Virginia has a lottery that they use, but basically less than 10% of their total revenue actually goes toward scholarship or merit scholarship or needs-based scholarship. So we didn't really include them in the study, but these are the states that have tended to be more on the forefront of that. So when we think about these, mostly around the South, most of them are merit-based scholarships, meaning that there has to be some type of achievement tie to this. So there's often you'll see where there's standardized test scores, there's GPA, and actually in one case there's actually class rank, which I find interesting for many reasons that I won't get into today as a former K-12 guy. But you'll see that that's mainly the focus. But we also see where needs-based aid, there's a lot of focus on post-secondary career and technical education, dual enrollment, and early childhood. Always, when I get a chance, I love to brag a little bit and talk about the good things going on in Kentucky. So actually the way Kentucky approaches the KEYS scholarship, you have more needs-based than merit-based scholarship aid, and it's really unique in the region. It's for the most part, everybody else really makes it very much pure scholarship. Kentucky seems to take a little bit more balanced approach and have both scholarship and the needs-based. So I know you guys know this, but I have found a long time ago it's good to start your presentation with just kind of level setting and making sure that we're all on the same place with where we're actually sitting right now. So as you know, there's the Kentucky Education Excellence Scholarship, or KEYS, the College Access Program, or the CAP grant, the Kentucky Tuition Grant, which is mainly need-based to private institutions, the Work Ready Kentucky Scholarship for the high-demand workforce, Dual Credit Scholarship, which is for general ed grades 11 and 12, Dual Work Ready Kentucky Scholarship, which is mainly in high school. Pretty proud of the fact that I got to be here on the ground floor for a couple of those when they were first created here. So let's start with Arkansas. Arkansas has a set of scholarships. They primarily started in 2009. And when we look at the Arkansas Academic Challenge Scholarship, which is a merit-based scholarship, they have to maintain a minimum GPA and earn credit hours per semester for continued eligibility. It is initially based on their merit coming out of high school and their scores on a standardized test. They actually have pretty defined rewards. Freshmen get $1,000, $4,000 go to sophomores, and that are at $3,000 actually can go to two-year institutions. Juniors and seniors get $5,000. Last year they had about 26,000 recipients to that. The Workforce Challenge, they actually has a focus on people with anyone with a high school diploma. It's not somebody currently in school. If you have a diploma, then you qualify for this. And it's focused on at least 1 year of workforce training in high demand areas. Now, y'all know this, but I'm going to say this to you anyway. One of the things that I think is a real point of pride in Kentucky is your data system is really one of the most robust in the country. It's certainly one of the most robust in the region. You're going to hear me talk about high need industry in several of these states. And I'm not saying this in any way to be disparaging, but I will tell you that having lived and worked here and having worked with these other states, the ability for Kentucky to identify high need industry, even down to a local community level, is pretty much unparalleled. You can often find that top five, but you can't necessarily get it down to, I mean, frankly, I know when I was here, and it probably has gotten better, we could identify the top five within about 30 miles of a school district, which is a pretty important deal. So with regard to the Workforce Challenge Scholarship, they focus it on, it's a little less on data and a little bit more on what they've identified as general categories. So they have identified informational technology, healthcare, and industry. Industrial, like construction and that sort of thing. They have a list of eligible programs, which I do think is pretty important. We saw this with the dual enrollment scholarship here in Kentucky. I know the first year we rolled it out, we actually saw where some kids used some of that money to take badminton. And we kind of realized that we needed to put a list and say, no, actually this needs to be done in a different way. And I'm assuming it's still done that way today. The Arkansas Concurrent Challenge Scholarship is for junior and high school students, juniors and seniors in high school, to take their dual enrollment, very similar to what is done here in Kentucky. They do have a maximum award of $125 per course, and Arkansas has pretty much a cap on what those course costs are at that level. The Challenge Plus Scholarship may not exceed $5,000 to any individual person, and the legislature sets a cap of about $25 million on there. This was first established in 2023. This is actually the first year that that's actually going to be implemented. Florida Bright Future Scholarship, the Academic Scholars and Medallion Scholars are both merit-based scholarships. The Gold Seal Vocational Scholars is focused on career education or certificate programs. Again, one little difference here is when you're talking about a certificate program, means that it can happen outside of a two-year college, but it's more focused on, rather than getting an associate's degree, it's actually finding ways for students to get into those certificate programs like welding and others that can get into the workforce faster. All of these do still have a GPA or standardized test requirement, although the Gold Seal vocational scholars isn't quite as high a bar as it is for the first two. Their Gold Seal CAPE scholars it's a career education or certificate program that is focused on professional industry certifications earned. So you can see with this one that's slightly different. The other one's focused a little bit more on post-secondary, whereas this one is actually a scholarship for kids while they're still in high school, with the intent of trying to incentivize students to get those industry certifications before they graduate. Interesting thing about Florida is that they actually have a minimum paid work hour or volunteer service hour requirement. So to receive this, you have to have shown either involvement in the community or have some type of record that you have had a certain number of hours of paid work. And from what we can tell, there's no requirement of it, like where the area is. It's just proof that the student is working. Georgia, which is sort of the granddaddy of these lottery programs. In fact, it was introduced for the first time in 1993. I was a high school science teacher at the time. I was getting married that year and thinking at some point I'm going to have kids, and boy, this is going to be great. College is going to be paid for because I'm going to live in Georgia my whole life. And, thank goodness that didn't actually work out that way because I'm glad to be here. But it took a lot of change over time. And it was very exciting. And, of course, what they found out is they sort of overshot a little bit. And over the years, they've had to pull back on it because the spending was exceeding what was being taken in by the lottery itself. So all of you, I'm sure, have heard of the Hope Scholarship. They have two really divisions of that. There's the Hope Scholarship and the Zell Miller Scholarship. The Zell Miller is actually the highest rating. You have to really have a high GPA, score highly on your standardized test, and you get 100% of tuition. When it looks at Hope, there's actually sort of what they call a factor rate, which basically is what the allocation set by the legislature is that covers a percentage of that tuition. So every year they take a look at what the revenue is, and the legislature decides we're going to allocate X number of dollars, and that factor is what is put throughout Georgia. By the way, I failed to mention this in Florida. One thing that makes it a little bit easier in Florida is they do have a universal course code legislation. They have universal transfer legislation. You may go, what's that got to do with scholarships? Well, actually, it makes things a little bit easier to be able to quantify and calculate tuitions because those things are a little bit more standardized in Florida. They're not completely. I'm sure the University of Florida has a very different tuition scale than most others, but it's a little bit more controlled environment. I bring that up because in Georgia, there's not a controlled environment. It's all over the place. So it is actually a little bit of a challenge for the Georgia Student Finance Commission to actually calculate this every year. So I will say that the factor rate was set at 100% for the first time last year. Georgia had record numbers of revenue, both in terms of the lottery and in terms of their overall tax revenue. So last year was the first time that they actually set that as 100%. They also, several years later, started a second thing. And so the key is you've got the Hope Scholarship and you've got the Hope Grant. The Hope Grant is focused on students who are moving toward some type of certification or some type of credentialing at a two-year college. So your Hope Grant, they used to have a much longer name, so luckily they figured out that acronym SWID or whatever it was is probably not the best. So they move that to be a focus on specific programs for employer demand. So they leverage their workforce board, similar to what we do here in Kentucky, similar to what you do in Kentucky with using those workforce innovation boards. The HOPE grant is also subject to that factor rate. So every year it may be 100%, it may not. You also have a HOPE division that actually helps students get the GED, that provides additional funding for students who are working toward getting that GED who have dropped out of school. And they actually use their lottery funds to on their pre-K program. It's a voluntary statewide pre-kindergarten that starts at the age of 4. So they use their scholarship dollars for that. South Carolina has several scholarships that they use. They primarily, with their Palmetto Fellows or Life Scholarship, it's about 2/3 of their revenue that they use, but it's focused on 2nd through 4th year. So basically the freshmen are kind of on their own. If you get through the freshman year, you have an opportunity. I don't know what the reason for that is, so I don't want to necessarily guess here, but as we saw this in Georgia, and I think we see it in other states, that freshman year you often have people who go to school and then they lose that scholarship. And so I think this was probably an attempt to say we're going to invest in students who actually are persisting. They also have a version of HOPE, which is for freshmen. So there is an opportunity for freshmen there, but it's a little bit more focused on students that are sophomore to senior. They also have need-based grants. It is the proverbial last dollar grant. So it's not awarded until after the student has filled out the FAFSA and there's been an evaluation of how much extra funds are needed before that is actually granted. They have a tuition assistance program for 2-year institutions. In that 2-year institution, it's awarded, again, in concert with that federal aid. And it can't be double, you can't double dip here. So you can't get the merit pay and get this. It's going to be an either or. They also have a workforce industry needs scholarship. It's focused on technical colleges. And again, it addresses workforce needs. There's a minimum of 5% of funding that they use toward dual enrollment. We couldn't find a lot of detail. We've been doing some work in South Carolina, and I think that they are working toward having a little bit more of a defined system when it comes to what those workforce needs are. But right now, I think it's still a little bit of what the statewide is versus trying to become any type of community base. The Tennessee system, they also have a HOPE scholarship. It's merit-based. It goes to students in both 2-year and 4-year institutions. There's a General Assembly Merit Scholarship that is a supplemental award for freshmen. They have an Aspire that is for entering freshmen with financial need, and a HOPE Scholarship for non-traditional undergraduate students. So this is where they're trying to get the students who have left high school, they've gone out into the work world, and now they're trying to get them back. Just as please understand, those of you who don't know me, I'm not in any way trying to dissuade you on anything or persuade you on anything, but I will say this, that one of the things we know about where the workforce is going is that we have a lot of people over the age of 25 and below the age of 65 that are going to basically not have a place to work over the next 5 to 8 years due to the changes in the workforce. So this is actually an attempt to bring those folks back to the table and get, whether it be just a certificate or whether it's to actually get a degree. They also have the Wilder NAFE, I think is how they say it, Technical Skills Grant, which again is focused on applied technology. They identified that as a high need in Tennessee. They have a lot of EV battery plants that are being built there, so they are kind of tweaking this to help address those needs. And they also have a dual enrollment grant as well. Before I go into the research, it dawned on me, a lot of you here know who we are, but for those of you that may not, we are an interstate compact. We are 75 years old. Many of you are members of our organization as appointed by either the head of your chamber or by the governor. We literally operate at your behest. Our job is to make you successful, whatever that means and however you define that. So that's why it's always a thrill to be here, because I love being in Kentucky, but also we love it when people actually call on us. That's why you can trust us to not come in with an agenda. Our job is to support you with the level of research. So speaking of that research, here's some things that we looked up or that we found. We did a literature review about the different scholarships that have been around for a while. And just being quite candid, there's not a lot. There's not a lot out there that gives us definitive, this is exactly the way you do this. And some of that is because the studies, maybe haven't been done. Some of it because sometimes the study is too narrow. But one of the things that we found pretty clear is there's a lot of agency reporting, statistics. There's not a lot of evaluation that goes on. You're going to see at the end, I'm going to make some suggestions. One of the things that if you come to any of our SRU meetings, you're going to hear me or others, usually me and others say, is as you guys are considering legislation, it's always a good idea to think, what kind of question am I going to have 5 years from now, so that the agency will collect that data and be able to give that to you. So as we were looking through all this, we found a lot of statistics, but not a lot of, we found this. I will point to Oklahoma, who has Oklahoma's Promise, which is actually a scholarship focused on, it's a needs-based scholarship for students who are first-generation college students, and it starts actually with supporting middle school. And they actually did an evaluation, and they actually had us come in and do an evaluation. And they found things like that, 89% of students actually stay in Oklahoma who go through that program versus those who go through others. They have a higher persistence rate. They tend to have higher over lifetime income. And so those types of things are actually one of the things I'm going to suggest to you at the end that you may want to consider is having that evaluation done so you know, is what we're doing actually working or not? We found that most merit-based programs serve a small percentage of students with need, and it's primarily for middle and upper income who are probably going to go post-secondary anyway. So when it's purely merit, you still kind of narrow that field a little bit. Much of the available research, unfortunately, is in the 90s and the early 2000s. So that tells you, we kind of have a history of this in education, right? We fall in love with an idea and we go with it until finally somebody goes, why are we doing it this way? And then all of a sudden we start thinking about that more. And it's interesting that apparently our partners in higher ed that do the research haven't found this as something that has needed a lot of research. So I'm going to go through this in a lot of detail. You have this, you can read it yourselves, but in '99, they found no evidence that the Georgia Hope program of great inflation, even though eligibility had increased. They had a slightly higher minority enrollment in the university system of Georgia. They met the goal of retaining more students in post-secondary. There were fewer than 25% retained for Hope in 4 years, and black students were most likely to lose eligibility and drop out. It's a pretty interesting study. I wish somebody would do that again. The grade inflation thing, as a K-12 person, I have to say I'm a little skeptical of whether or not there's grade inflation, but it is actually why Georgia started putting a few more things in there besides just having a 3.0 GPA. In '99, there was another study done where half of the recipients lost eligibility after the first academic year. Again, that kind of mentioned that earlier. In 2000, there was a Hope Scholarship study done, again in Georgia, on that the main positive effect improving college going rates were concentrated on middle and upper income white students with no observable effect on black students. 2020, the Georgia Budget and Policy Institute did a study and found that white and Asian students were most likely to receive the Hope Scholarship. Black and Native American students were least likely, and most likely it was correlated with household income. In Florida, the Policy Program Analysis and Government Accountability did a study, or did an evaluation, maybe a better way to say that. They found that it does make college more affordable for many families. It improved post-secondary preparation. Saw greatest increase in college prep and persistence rates among minority students, and it showed an increasing requirements to control costs, likely to the disproportionate negative effects on minority and at-risk students. They further found that there tended to be the highest renewals tended to be in the merit-based. Kind of would expect that, right? The lowest were in our CTE programs. They attributed it to weaker post-secondary preparation. This is a Pruitt thought, so this is not in any way part of the study here, so don't misinterpret. I would say that probably has a little bit to do with the levels of support that a lot of those students were getting about what do you actually need to take to get this degree. Not to brag a little bit, but my brother-in-law is the president of one of the largest career and technical colleges in Georgia, and they revamped their counseling program, for instance, to put kids don't get to choose courses. They sit down with their mentor or their advisor every semester and say, if you take this course before you take this course, you can actually get this certification. And it actually is a different level of support that we're starting to see in more places as well. Also found in 2021 that they accumulated more debt than non-recipients, which was interesting. There was no effect among lower income recipients. So you'd think that you would actually have less debt if you were the recipient of one of these, but apparently somehow they're finding a way to still borrow money. In 2014, Tennessee did an audit. They found that the distribution may not be fair. And of course, you know how these audits go. There's a lot of maybes and could be's, but they were not verifying that GPAs for eligibility were actually done in compliance with the policy. The policy left the calculation to schools. They have since changed that because they felt that it's better. Georgia actually did that as well. They moved it to the Georgia Student Finance Commission so that no matter what's on your transcript, it gets sent and there's a calculation done at that level because there are certain things that don't count. So if a kid takes a high school, their senior year all PE classes, those aren't going to count. So just some closing thoughts. I would, one of the things, like I said, we saw is there's not a lot of great research that supports for or against how to do this. Things that you might want to consider as you're looking at this are, what are your rates of lost eligibility? What's the persistence to graduation? Are you actually lowering student debt? Is there actually that return on investment? I think that's actually a conversation that's happening a lot in dual enrollment across the South right now. Is there a point of diminishing return where you are putting all that money but you're actually not getting all that out? What's the effect on unmet student need? What's the effect on time to degree? What career fields are being chosen? Are we really giving guidance for that? Is there an effect on course-taking patterns? It may sound a little bit odd, but if you spend your freshman year not really taking courses that get you toward a degree, that matters, right? And then finally, I think, and again, this is something you'll hear me say every time you hear me talk to anybody that'll listen. Have you set a North Star for what you want your workforce to look like over the next decade? And is the policies that are going on in this case, are your scholarships actually getting you toward what needs to happen in Kentucky to really meet the workforce needs of the future? So with that, I'm happy to take questions, and we will also be giving you a report on this at a later time too that gives you actual numbers and all that sort of stuff.
Thank you, Dr. Pruitt. I think your presentation was spot on to some of the things that we're kind of looking for here. Some comparison to other states, yes, but I think your comments about the workforce development is spot on too. We're in a transitional period here in Kentucky, and I believe the call for an evaluation of the alignment of those scholarships and how they do fall in line with the direction the state is going and our workforce needs is something that needs to be done to give us a better handle on what directions to take here and as we go forward with the lottery funding of scholarships. You made a comment also about a lot of our workforce that's coming back, and they're not your typical, they're not just your high school graduates. They are those folks in their 20s and 30s and sometimes older and 40s that are coming back into figuring out a way to take classes to meet the workforce needs and to stay in employment. And so I do want to stress the importance of those certification programs in our vocational school areas. It's been a focus of mine from this inception here of this committee. So we do have some, I believe, a question here. Representative Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Pruitt, it's awful good to see you back in the Commonwealth. Thank you for what you do. My question may be a little different, and it may be a comment as well as a question. Are there any states that give a reward on the back end? In other words, when you graduate. And the reason I ask that question is because we put such an emphasis on getting kids to go to college, and then we know that the graduation rate is not as high as we would like it to be. I know I heard Dr. Capilouto the other day mention that UK's had gone from 58 to 70, and they were awful excited about that achievement. But we're spending a lot of money up front, and students then are dropping out. So is that going on anywhere where they say, hey, you made it, here's some money for making it, as opposed to giving it up front and them dropping out after a year?
I have actually not seen that anywhere. It's an interesting idea. I think that the closest I've seen, and I can't remember the state, but I actually don't think it passed, but I think it was introduced as an idea of some type of tax credit for the first couple of years after you have graduated. But it didn't pass, so it's not been implemented in any state that I know of. But it's kind of, I've heard a little bit of rumblings of that kind of conversation, but I don't think it's had any type of form to it.
Thank you.
Representative Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the opportunity to participate today. President Pruitt, always a pleasure to have you in the Commonwealth. Enjoy working with you at SREB. Whoa, I got a lot of questions. One question just comes to mind in relation to what Representative Riley asked. In regard to completion and retaining students, are there any states that focus scholarships on that year 3, year 4? Because a lot of the reasons that students do not complete is because of financial need. So are there any states looking at something like that where in year 3, year 4, there's some additional supplemental scholarships to help them get to that completion?
Yes, sir. So South Carolina actually uses about 2/3 of their life scholarship for 3rd and 4th year students. There's some available for those early years, but their focus is to try to help the students once they get to 3rd and 4th year. Because I think it's, arguably part of that is that's also when life starts to happen for a lot of people. They get married, kids come along, and they end up with those financial strains. South Carolina is probably the one that's most prominent on that as focusing it on the back end. I've not seen where there are other states that have put state funds into that. I think at that point they start looking more toward the federal funds through FAFSA.
Chair, if I could follow up.
Yes, sir.
On the discussion of merit versus needs-based, what's the trend you're seeing in the southern states? Is there more focus on needs-based versus merit-based? Where's that trend going?
I'd say the trend is moving more toward needs-based. Not that they're backing off of merit-based so much, but that there's a recognition that, especially in workforce-driven career fields, whether it be two-year degrees or certifications, that there's a significant barrier to students to being able to get into those types of programs when it's needs-based. There are some states that have been more prominent. I mean, Kentucky, like I said, they are actually kind of a leader on that. We've not seen anybody back off of the needs-based, but we've seen increases in the needs-based over the last decade.
Is there anything out there for that student who is almost Pell eligible but not? If you understand where I'm going,
I do.
You've got the Pell eligible student, like here in Kentucky, they get the CAP grant. We've got the Keys scholarship. However, that student is not Pell eligible, they've got the Keys scholarship. And maybe it's a challenge for them and their family. Are there any states that are focusing on what I call that lower middle income family?
Well, I'd say the closest would be states that are using state money for what you might call last dollar scholarships, where after they have gone through the FAFSA process, they go, okay, so we're going to fund the difference. Well, if you're not quite Pell, even that's not going to necessarily help you a whole lot, right? Because they may give them a percentage of what you could have gotten, but there's still a pretty significant gap. I've not, Georgia has kind of ingrained in that Hope scholarship culture that they've created over the years. They sort of have taken that a little bit off the table in that they, both for the merit and for the grant, they do it mainly based on pure GPA and standardized scores. Arguably, the part you get into the question is how does that overlay with the workforce stuff?
Sure.
But I would say they kind of took that off the table so that if you're not quite eligible for Pell, you do get that. Now, the reality is if you also aren't eligible for Pell, even in Georgia, when you get that scholarship, it's not covering book costs, living costs, and so that still ends up being an impediment if you're just under that Pell eligibility.
Of course, Mr. Chairman, you and I discussed this yesterday here in Kentucky. We had the Kentucky Workforce Scholarship for those who do not have associate's degree in the five high demand areas. So we're getting some of those technical courses in there, but there's really for that individual who maybe is taking a general education, more typical college-based experience that's not eligible for them. Thank you.
Representative Timoney.
Chairman, thank you. And Commissioner, thank you for coming up. You know, you always bring a lot of thought-provoking information. You're a servant leader when you were here in the Commonwealth as Commissioner. So I want to thank you for that too publicly. A couple of comments really quickly. Dr. Thompson spoke before this committee and he talked about the 600,000 people in Kentucky that are a certificate away. And he said that was his number one group to really go after. And I think one of the realities that we're going to have conversations specifically about where we're allocating our resources. I know that's the purpose of this committee, and this is what the comments, we keep saying it over and over. I know the burden, we're thinking the lottery is going to bail us out, but they have a fixed pie. And yes, they're having great years with sales, but at the same time, our universities aren't getting any cheaper. So they're both racing, but the lottery's not keeping up. So we're going to have to be strategic about this. One of the things I want to go on record and make sure is that we're doing the things for our CTE programs at the same time as retaining our best and brightest, because we want to attract those industries that pay huge amounts of money to keep our people here. And right now we are doing that, but not nearly to the level we're losing. There's a brain drain in Kentucky for our top kids. And that's where the true wealth and true enrichment of Kentucky is going to come from, is that group. So I think both groups are going to need to walk hand in hand in this path. And I think it would be very problematic for the future of where we want to go if we start picking winners and losers in that conversation too. So thank you for your information today.
Thank you. And if I may, I have to say, based on your comment, that one of the things I think that we've got to start thinking about is, instead of asking kids where they're going to college, asking them simply what's next. Because I think the longer we keep two separate groups, one's always going to feel inferior to the other. What we know is that automation and artificial intelligence is changing the world. What we know is that study we did that many of you are aware of, we may see as many as 18 million unemployable adults by 2030 in the South. 240,000 of those live in Kentucky. We have 20 plus million functionally illiterate adults in the South alone. And so actually what you're describing is it's not just important. I mean, it's critical to the whole economy of the country. And if we don't find ways, whether it be through lottery, state, whatever, especially to get the folks who have left school for a while, get the people upskilled that are currently in the workforce. Because, I mean, I shared this with the folks that were at our board meeting in June. There's a Chick-fil-A 8 miles from my house that you do not see a person. You type in your order and a robot delivers you the food, and a robot has cooked the food. And that's where we're headed. And so thinking about career and technical education, it's not just learning how to, the right angle for a nail. It's actually content knowledge as well as the skill knowledge. And that's why I say I don't think there can be two groups anymore. It's got to be, how are we preparing the workforce of Kentucky or the South? Sorry, I don't mean to get preachy there, but that's
you're
a
right
big
on
thing for
point.
me.
I think you're right on point. So thank you.
It's crazy.
Does anybody else have a question? Yes.
Mr. Chairman, can we take a field trip to this Chick-fil-A? I've got to see this.
Come on down. We're happy to have you. It's wild. I'll just tell you, it's crazy.
I do have one more question before we let you go. In your studies of the other surrounding states, you mentioned, there was a kind of a missing element of review of the programs and those things. When you looked at the other states, did you find that maybe from the early 2000s, 90s, that maybe these workforce innovation boards, are they fluid in keeping up with the different workforce shortage needs? Are they stagnant? Or do they still have the same top 5 priorities that they had 20 years ago? What did you come across, if anything, along those lines in the idea of review and oversight?
So I'm going to answer you in the briefest way I know how on that question. But frankly, you could have me back for a whole other hour on that. This is a really close to home for me. One of the things in my time here that I was most proud of is, and I don't know how it's done yet now, so if it's changed, I'm not saying anything negative about anybody, but one thing I was very proud of is the partnership that we created with our workforce innovation boards, and we moved the approval of pathways and credentials out of the department and moved it to the people who actually are hiring. I mean, to me, my thing was, why am I the one that's deciding what career pathways we need? Because we should be just preparing the kids. And we were able to do that, though, because of the data system of KY Stat. What we see around the South, and frankly, I think even broader than that, is there is very rarely a lot of coordination between the education system and the workforce system. There's rarely, in fact, Kentucky really is one of the few states that has a single hub that allows you to look at workforce and education data in the same place. A lot of states, the Department of Labor or Commerce sits over here to the side, and that's where the workforce boards sit. So they don't necessarily integrate with the education system a whole lot. Some, and this drives us crazy at SREB, use different data sets. So education will use a data set to say, here's our 5 priorities. And workforce says, well, actually, these are our 5 priorities. So it's a long way to answer your question. I don't think that we see a great deal of fluidity. I think that we see where things kind of stick in one place for a while. But I would also say that we have a lot of areas around the South and the country that are playing one-eyed darts, where they're kind of close one eye and throwing the dartboard, and they're probably close, but I don't think that they have quite figured out what their North Star is.
Well, thank you very much. I think one other aspect of your review of other states is, and we have lots of different avenues for scholarship opportunities.
You do.
And our folks do a great job. There are just some areas that I think that we really need to focus some attention with marketing of those programs. I don't know how well they're known throughout the state, especially as some of the teacher workforce scholarship programs, or those that are already have bachelor's degrees, that are already in college, that maybe they're out there, that some of them may not realize that there is money available for those programs, for adult education programs.
I think that's right.
And I would love to see us just market, take some of those workforce shortage needs and to help boost up maybe some of the applications for those scholarships. So thank you for your time today. We appreciate it, and we're going to move on now to our second presenter. If there's not any more.
Thank you.
Not any more questions for him?
See some of you in Nashville tomorrow.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Pruitt. It's good to see you again.
Thank you.
Before we move on to our second presenter, we did not have a quorum when we first started for the minutes. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes? Motion. Do I have a second? Second. All in favor? Aye. All right. Nays? All right. Minutes approved. All right. Our second presenter for today, Mr. Ballmann. I believe he is joining us via Zoom. Is he with us?
Yep, I'm here. Thank you, Senator Deneen.
Please introduce yourself, and you may begin.
Well, thank you. So my name is Frank Ballmann. I'm with the National Association of State Student Grant and Aid Programs, and we are the 40-something state agencies that provide grant and scholarship aid to students across the country. So our Kentucky member is the Kentucky Higher Education Assistance Authority. And well, first of all, I say Dr. Pruitt gave a great presentation. That's a tough act to follow. And I think his closing thoughts slide, I was busy trying to write them all down because those are things we could talk about all day and all night. But my objective today is kind of give you a feel for nationally how states are doing. But first of all, I just want to say, well, I wish I could be there with you today in Kentucky. My boss told me that every dollar you spend in travel is one less dollar for student grant aid. But I am very familiar with Kentucky. My dad was born and raised in Cloverport, Kentucky, which is, I think, about it's closer to Owensboro than where you are, but I've been back there many times. And I'm also familiar with the challenges of setting up a scholarship program because after my dad died, I tried to set up a scholarship program with the church he grew up in there. And we had a year of a nursing scholarship and a year of a teaching scholarship, but the pastor changed and just said, well, this is too much work. And that was that. So it's, scholarships and grants are a noble goal, but the devil is in the details. So that being said, NASGAP members nationally provide about $13 billion in state grant and scholarship aid annually. Our conferences are a bit different from a lot of other conferences that they're closed press, they're off the record, and really the goal is for states to share best practices, what's working in their state and what lessons they've learned. We're kind of non-political in that our NASGAP only takes positions on issues if we have a unanimous vote of the executive committee, but on the other hand, you'd be a little surprised how often we do that. I'm just realizing I have a PowerPoint to show, so let me share my screen. Can you see that in the room there?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Just trying to get it to go to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so we've already covered most of this. And my role in federal relations is really to tell Congress and the White House and the administration, the Department of Education, what's going on in the laboratories of democracy, because a lot of times they're interested in hearing how states are pursuing programs that they might think about joining in and trying to enact those programs at the federal level. So I first started with NASGAP in 2010, and in the Obama administration, there's a lot of focus on Tennessee Promise, and also in Indiana's 21st Century Scholars Program. And the key difference between those two programs is that Dr. Pruitt mentioned the idea of a last dollar program. So Tennessee Promise is the last dollar program in that it covers all of the costs after your federal and state aid is awarded. The Indiana program is what we call a first dollar program, meaning you get that award and then you can use Pell and state grant, other state grant aid on top of that to maybe get past just tuition, also cover things like room and board or books and things like that. So why do states have state financial aid? I think as Dr. Pruitt kind of addressed, one of the biggest reasons is a better educated workforce, helps attract jobs and helps attract employers that have jobs. And one of my favorite talking points is there's something called the job openings and labor turnover survey, or JOLTS for short. And that's produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics on the Department of Labor. And it historically showed there's about 6 million unfilled jobs in America. During COVID, it got up to being over 11 million unfilled jobs and still around 9 or 10. Now, some of those are jobs that maybe no one wants, but a lot of them are jobs that require a certain set of skills that the workforce doesn't already have. So they need to get a degree or certificate to fill those jobs. And I think you talked a little bit during Dr. Pruitt's presentation, the Q&A, about helping people complete it. It's not just about access, it's about completing. And Tennessee Reconnect and other programs like that are getting a lot of attention for issues like, okay, there's a lot of students who stopped out, a lot of them due to the cost issue or the lack of financial aid. And they might only be a few credits short of a degree, or they might only be a few credits away from getting a different degree that is, say, a 21st century skill as opposed to a 20th century skill. So I always tell people that I have a background in computer science, but the classes I took in college are for programming languages that can only be used at the Smithsonian in the computers that are behind the glass there. So the big debate sort of is need-based versus, we call it non-need-based, but merit-based is probably more common. Over the last 10 plus years, the percentage of need-based aid nationally in state programs has grown from about 2/3 to 3/4 of aid dollars, but it sort of plateaued around there. And I think the big talking points Dr. Pruitt alluded to for need-based aid is that's the way you kind of move the needle on the college going rate and producing more graduates. Because one way I like to explain, the sort of one of the metrics is how many additional degrees are you producing for each dollar of aid you give to higher education. That being said, passing a program requires popular support and typically bipartisan support. So that definitely suggests at least having a program that is going to help a lot more middle-class students go to college. But at the end of the day, as Dr. Pruitt once again alluded to, the ultimate goal is completion. It's not just access. So if you're getting students into school and they're stopping out, maybe it's time to consider what you can do to better improve retention. And talking about Southern schools, there's a program in Georgia State called the Panther Retention Grant Program. So that wasn't really state funded, except indirectly since that's a public institution. But it's kind of an emergency grant program where students, and is really focused on juniors and seniors, if they had something come up like their car broke down and they couldn't make classes, you'd get a grant to pay for the car repair to keep you in school. The other big consideration in grants and scholarships is, we talked about this a little bit earlier, Dr. Pruitt did, keeping the best and brightest in state. So I think that was sort of the original goal of the Georgia Hope Scholarship, was to have the best and brightest go to Georgia colleges and institutions of higher ed, as opposed to having them go out of state. I think the nuance to give some thought to, and I think it was Representative Raleigh mentioned the idea of back-end rewards or rewarding students for graduation, because if you give someone a scholarship and they graduate and then they leave the state, it's like, well, was that a good investment? So there's been some experimentation around how do you keep the best and brightest in state. Two examples I could give is Texas had they called it the Be on Time loan. And the idea of the Be on Time was if you graduate with at least a B average and you graduate on time, meaning 4 years for most programs and 5 years for engineering, all of the loans were forgiven. That program is no longer around. Part of it was the people who didn't graduate on time sometimes were unable to repay the loans, and there's nothing more painful than having a student graduate on time with a 2.98 GPA and being told you didn't qualify. There are some other states that have what some people in Washington, D.C. like to refer to as groans, which are grants that become loans if you leave the state after you graduate. So that sort of gives you a little incentive, to keep people in state. But on the other hand, administratively trying to convert that to a loan and track the student down and they leave the state is a bit challenging. So in terms of how programs are funded, I think you might have NASCAP produces an annual survey report which shows in a lot of detail what sorts of programs each state runs and how they're funded and things like that. We only talk about the funding for the primary need-based program in that particular report. So in addition to the states that Dr. Pruitt mentioned, Nebraska, Oregon, and Missouri also have grant programs that are funded at least in part by lottery funding. We don't cover programs that are not need-based that are covered by the lottery, so you wouldn't see a L next to Tennessee down in that line. But the important part about funding state grant programs is really sustainability, because the goal is to fund the student through graduation, not just fund their first year, because there's nothing that turns, I always tell people that state grants and federal Pell Grants, they're not spending their investment, because the future tax dollars you generate from your programs usually far exceeds the cost of the program. I mean, Illinois had a study from many years ago that showed each dollar of need-based grant produced $6 in incremental state tax revenue. And that doesn't get into, say, the multiplier effect of how much more that college grad spent on, as businesses in the state, how much those state businesses paid in state income taxes. So I think that that's kind of a quick overview of what other states are doing. I'm happy to answer questions or dive in a lot deeper in any of the topics that I kind of breezed through kind of quickly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ballmann. Is there any questions anyone has for Mr. Ballmann? All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you for joining us via Zoom. Thank you for the information. We have some information from you and from your PowerPoint to review. I know there's some additional numbers at the back of the handout that you all have been given to look at in comparison to other states. So I think that'll be a wealth of information for us to consider as well. Our next meeting. If there's not any discussion or any further concerns, our next meeting will be October the 19th at 3 p.m. Is there a motion to adjourn? Motion.